everybody, Katy Lees here, Principal 340B Compliance Advisor with Virtue 340B. Welcome back to Katy's 340B Compass. I was trying to think, there's so many things to talk about lately, and I kind of just wanted to go back to the normal, like talking about compliance. My next video is gonna cover just some basic, what you can control in this very chaotic 340B world. But first, there's, of course, always such hot topics out here. So I want to talk about the data policies. So the new manufacturer data policies. And while this is controversial, I don't necessarily want to get too controversial, hopefully. Maybe that's not possible, but I had a post on LinkedIn recently and it got some attention and it got some, like, one comment I really appreciated was someone that said that they spend, I don't believe that they said they still work in the pharmaceutical industry, but that, there is a lot of misunderstanding on the pharma side of, just basic operations and data flow and things like that. And I that's not a surprise, right? Like, we know that we don't know each other's, process as solidly as, we should, to be at such odds and have such opinions on each other's, position and perspective. So, I think there's a lot to learn from both sides, both perspectives. Certainly at Virtue 340B, we take great pride in 340B education. So if anyone, in any of the stakeholder categories of the 340B world, want to talk and maybe, partner on getting some education or insights. I don't know, that might be controversial on its own for me to say, but I do think that we have a lot to learn from each other and to hopefully someday, find somewhere that we can meet in the middle. At least on a couple, on some points, because I'm sure it's not going to be on everything, but even if we go to a rebate policy, which it seems like HRSA is definitely headed in that direction, we need to understand each other so that it can work. And I see these data policies, I would like to think they're a better solution, but even if they're, just a transitional phase where we're learning about data and, on both sides, how to submit it and how to interpret it and use it, maybe this time is something that we can learn from. Certainly all of the activity in the first part of 2026, learning from maximum fair price. I've talked about this, there's a lot to learn there of just what the flow of data looks like, what it looks like to have rebates denied and have to dispute that, and just the communication back and forth on working through those. There's always stuff to learn. So again, today I just kind of wanted to talk through, share my thoughts on the manufacturer policies, my experience. I think that obviously there's still a lot of differing opinions on covered entities abiding by these policies. And I'm not going to take position there because I can see both sides. I think that there are risks with complying with the policies and submitting data, and what will that data be used for, misinterpretations, and the reconciliation. Let's say covered entities submit the data and it's all, I think at this point, flowing through 340B ESP. I believe the goal is to reconcile it with purchasing data. I think also the goal is to reconcile it with claims, commercial and Medicaid claims, to validate rebates where there's overlap on rebates paid in the commercial and the Medicaid space and 340B transactions. That part I get. I definitely get that. I think I do take some issue with that, the attempt to do this continual reconciliation with purchases. This is what we've experienced in the space for, the contract pharmacy restrictive policies, is that you could submit your data and have basically full access. That has long since gone away. And so now you can designate a pharmacy per manufacturer. If you don't have your own, you submit that data. It's reconciled in the back end by, the 340B ESP platform. And then if you're with a covered entity or you support a covered entity, I'm sure you're familiar with those notices that say your purchases exceed the activity you have submitted. You have 10 days or 30 days to rectify this, or you're going to lose access to 340B pricing. So sometimes maybe there's an issue, whether it be, I think rarely purposefully, but that not all the data is submitted, so it's not going to reconcile with purchasing. But it's also important to understand that this isn't just a static process. Prescriptions might be dispensed and then returned to stock. They might be dispensed and then captured for 340B, and then someone reviews it and decides it shouldn't have been 340B, or maybe it's not captured or deemed 340B eligible for 2 weeks or 30 days or maybe even 90 days. That's probably less common, but it's not completely abnormal. So it's just not a completely fluid process. So, expecting within every time window, whatever that is, we'll call it, 30 or 45 days. I think most of these policies are 45 days to expect to reconcile and just be able to tie this up with a nice bow. That's really hard to do. It depends on the volume, obviously, that it's the level of complexity. But as we get into these all claims policies and you have organizations, large and small, submitting all of their activity, and that's attempted to be reconciled with all of their purchases, that's just really hard to do. I'm a data person, and I know that that's just really hard to do. There's just a lot of nuances. There's, things being purchased in different settings, just again, different timing. Even let's just take contract pharmacy alone. I think most covered entities work with 2 or 3 vendors at least to manage their contract pharmacy arrangements. Prescriptions might be being, qualified, captured, replenished, every step of the way at different timing frequencies. So I don't know. It's hard to just sit here and blab about it. But it is very complicated. So that's one fear that I have with these policies. Again, if it's just for transparency and it's so the manufacturers can identify all prescriptions where 340B was used, so that on the back end they have that to, understand the rebates that they're paying out or validate compliance with paying out these, Medicaid rebates or maximum fair price rebates. I get that. But, so yeah, and there's some covered entities that are not yet ready to abide by those because, again, I think there's merit in pushing back on this too. Because this is a very challenging time. Covered entities, obviously I'm biased, are certainly not the bad guys. But we are always at the bottom of the chain, not really, don't have a lot of power in this. So, there comes a time where it might be appropriate to take a stand and try to push back. It's going to be an uphill battle for sure, because HRSA doesn't seem to be stepping in. There's really doesn't seem to be any regulatory body that is here to mediate or help. It's really left, it seems, between the pharmaceutical industry and the covered entities. So yeah, like I said, I totally understand both sides. I guess for the rest of this, I'm just going to talk for a few more minutes just about if you are abiding by these policies. It's still not just easy. It's a decision that needs to be made at an organization level. This is not a decision that someone sitting at their desk by themselves at a covered entity should be deciding I am or I am not going to do, submit data in response to these policies. It needs to be a larger conversation. It is a business decision. There are risks on both sides to be evaluated. And for those that evaluate that and they determine that they're going to move forward and submit the data, it's challenging to collect all that data. Again, if you have a contract pharmacy, you might have multiple vendors that you need to pull that data from. If you have an in-house pharmacy, that's probably one of the easier ones. If you have an in-house outpatient or specialty retail pharmacy, because prescription data is fairly straightforward, especially if it's your own from your own system. And then, the medical data is definitely the challenge across the board. I haven't spoken to anyone that doesn't think that's a challenge. Sending out claims data after it's already been billed to a payer or, even reimbursed by a payer, I'm going to say that's nearly impossible because medical data, medical claims, they're just their own creature. It varies so much in timing by payer, by so many factors that I'm not going to pretend to understand. So in my opinion, when it comes to pulling any of this data, do the best you can. Because, one thing I've really been living by more and more lately is do not let perfection kill progress. Because in the 340B program, I don't think perfection exists. So, it's just doing the best you can. So, pulling the data, determining the appropriate cadence for your organization, whether that be daily, weekly, maybe monthly. I think monthly is a risk, but, depending on your size and the resources you can dedicate, it's, again, whatever you can do. So, just trying to, what is the most feasible source to get this data? It's, on the medical side, I think it's at the point of administration, that charge level data. Again, it's in any world, whatever medical claims you're sending, it's very difficult to downstream tie that back to, if you have a medical claim from, let's just say Medicaid, and you're trying to tie that to a medical claim from any covered entity. That's just challenging because, there is no prescription number. There is no patient level identification. And I know that's probably the goal for the companies that are requesting the data is they want to be able to tie it to that rebate data. That's just going to be really hard. Again, it would be helpful if at some point parties could come together and maybe, talk about what's feasible, what makes the most sense, how to use this data. I think if we ever get any sort of federal legislation, hopefully there can be some, collaboration and agreement on what data makes the most sense. But yeah, I think there's a lot of just misconceptions. There was the letter from Eli Lilly that went to HRSA's, talked about that the data that's being requested is the same data that's billed to covered to Medicaid, Medicare, commercial payers every day. It isn't true. There's certainly a lot of the same data elements, but that data is not what would be submitted because most of the time it is not identified that it's 340B eligible or not. And, there's that's every prescription. Pharmacies are billing every prescription to those, to payers, not just 340B eligible. So there's, that's pretty high level, whether it's understood or not is not very accurate. So yeah, I could probably talk about this forever. But I just thought it was, something that I had an interest in sharing because I know this is something so many people are struggling with. And hopefully at some point we'll have some sort of relief. I don't know if these are going away, but again, just doing the best we can to manage them, to minimize the impact. And I guess we'll see how this progresses. So have a great day. Thanks. Bye. Do you have a 340B compliance question? Send us a message at virtue340b.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode for more expert 340B advice. Talk to you soon.